whirling through space, drifting toward eternity. Mystical sparks encircled by loneliness and cold darkness. Are you afraid? So are a lot of other people. One of the reasons witchcraft has survived through the ages is because man's need to coerce destiny and subdue the fear within has never subsided.
You've been listening to the 1969 Warner Brothers release Seduction Through Witchcraft by Louise Huebner, with music by Louis and Bebe Barron. Best known for the 1956 film Forbidden Planet. The Barons were friends with... Sorry. The Barons were friends with collaborators with such people as John Cage, Anais Nin, Maya Deren, as well as Huebner, the official witch of Los Angeles County. But it's also, by the Barons' own reckoning, the work of various non-human entities, cybernetic vacuum tube oscillator circuits inspired by the writings of Norbert Wiener, built by Louis Barron and treated in the recording process as actor collaborators with intentionalities and personalities of their own. While this record is rarely considered a masterpiece, it's an early text in the mainstream occult explosion of the 1960s and early 70s, which saw the spread of previously underground currents via records and paperback books. A lot has been written about the UK occult electronic musicians of the late 70s and 80s, but when the first explicitly occult major label record releases were being released in the late 60s, electronic music was already their soundtrack. But the connections between electronic music and the esoteric goes much further back, all the way to the very beginning in 1944. This talk will look into 3 cases of artists working in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, with a particular focus in each one: Halim El-Dabh and the documentation and continuation of oral ritual musical traditions, Daphne Oram and the construction of a metaphysics from her technical knowledge of acoustics and audio electronics, and the Barons, who conceived of their musical practice as a collaboration with artificial entities. I want to be upfront and say that the people that I'll be discussing would probably not have considered themselves practitioners, although Oram was actively involved in paraphysical research, and El-Dabh was obviously comfortable in the role of a transmitter of ritual practices. There are, however, esoteric ideas at play in their process, such as entity work and a poetic understanding of reality based on correspondences and metaphor. And they all had personal connections to esoteric figures. This talk is intended as a very basic overview and is by no means exhaustive of the subject. There's a great deal of debate about where to place the beginning of electronic music. But if you want to talk about definitive break with past musical practices, as opposed to electronics as extensions of existing keyboard and string techniques, it really begins with a mass adoption of magnetic recording tape in the 1940s and 50s. This is the beginning of what we would today call sampling and sequencing, the organization of arbitrary sounds in time using techniques that are the same regardless of pitch, timbre, or volume. This music has come to be called tape music, a term which encompasses a wide range of subjects and techniques. Magnetic tape was the last major analog recording technology to be developed, but it was also the most plastic. It can be very tightly edited without worrying about pops or the other distracting artifacts. It can be looped at any length. It can be reversed. A number of these things could be done with earlier media, but not all of them, and not easily or as well. Tape turned sound into physical objects. The official history of tape music starts in Paris in 1948 or so, with Pierre Schaeffer beginning experiments in composing with concrete sounds, that is, recordings of real-world sounds, such as trains or water drops. This work was followed 2 years later with the development of a German school of electronic music, based in Cologne, built up of recordings of pure waveforms generated by precision electronic oscillators. The dichotomy between those two schools, one beginning with the exploration of complex recorded materials and creating a work from there, and the other beginning with an abstract concept and building the sounds mathematically from basic components, provides the fundamental narrative for understanding 1950s tape music. The only problem is that it's wrong. In 1944, 4 years before Schaeffer began working with manipulated recorded sounds, a young Coptic student started playing with it with Cairo Radio's new magnetophone tape machine, using it to re-record and manipulate wire recordings he'd made around the city. His name was Halim El-Dabh. These included especially recordings he'd made of the Tsar or Tsar rituals. The Tsar are spirits similar to jinn. They're thought to accumulate around people and are associated with everything from bad luck to depression to health issues. The ritual is a combination of exorcism and block party involving music and trance dancing. It's also primarily a women's ritual. It's often held in public spaces blocked off in some way. El-Dabh made a number of recordings both from outside and inside the ritual space. He took these recordings back to the studio and replayed them through a variety of processing devices, including rooms with movable walls to filter the sounds in various ways, and created a 24-minute piece called Expressions of Tsar, which was later played at that year at a local art gallery, marking the first public performance of experimental tape piece. And it sounded a bit like this. The entire piece is missing, but a 2-minute piece remains. After the war, El-Dabh would receive funding to study music in the US under Aaron Copland and others. As one of the few composers in the US to have worked with tape music, it's not surprising that when Columbia and Princeton universities set up their tape music studio in New York City at the end of the decade, he would become one of the first outside composers working with them from 1959 to the early 60s. El-Dabh's work, however, was very different from the other composers' pieces. His piece, Layla and the Poet, created in 1959 and released on the record Columbia Princeton Electronic Music Studio Center in 1964, is a good example. The work is a mix of pure tones, repitched human voices, and fragments of North African percussion, continuing the exploration of trance drumming techniques he'd begun as a student. And I think also you can hear in the way that the voices are manipulated, certain types of estrangements sometimes found in ritual. During the early 60s, he would move away from using tape recorders as compositional tools and return to field recordings, take several trips, especially to Africa, to document and record traditional music. This led to his teaching African musicology, ethnomusicology at Kent State. For 2 decades, he continued composing non-electronic music, and while mostly unknown in the United States and Europe, his work is well known in Egypt. During his last year at Kent State in 1989, he began working with ACE, the group who put on the Starwood Esoteric Festival. He appears on their cassette release from that year, Self in Transformation, in discussion with Donald Michael Craig and Robert Anton Wilson. Beginning the next summer, he would teach regular drumming workshops at the festival for over a decade and is credited in the book The Pagan Man with introducing a much-needed structure to U.S. neo-pagan drum circles. His early electronic music was restored by one of his former students in the early 2000s and is starting to receive the recognition it really didn't during the 20th century. Throughout El-Dabh's work, from his impressionistic documentation of the Tsar ritual in 1944 to his Starwood ritual workshops 5 decades later, you can see a commitment to furthering ritual music traditions. In interviews where he discusses his philosophy, ideas of resonance and harmonics resound, ideas we'll see recurring. Stepping back to the 1940s to England, where the war had provided an opening for women to take on technical roles at the BBC, a number of them stayed on afterwards in mid-level positions. One of these was a recording engineer and then studio manager named Daphne Oram. Oram's father was an amateur paranormal researcher, an active spiritualist, and she grew up with well-known mediums conducting seances in her home. She would later follow in his footsteps, at one point even exploring the acoustic properties of ley lines. In the 1950s, she and her colleague Desmond Briscoe would become fascinated with the new tape music they were hearing from France, Germany, and Italy, and started coming in after hours to work on whatever equipment they could find. In 1957 and 58, they were asked to do sound for a number of experimental radio plays, the success of which led to permission for them to found a specialized department at the BBC Radiophonic Workshops. The impact of the Radiophonic Workshops on future electronic music probably cannot be overstated. Their work in the 1950s and 60s primed the pump, as it were, for the explosion of British electronic music in the 70s and beyond. But its formation also led to Oram's time at the end of Oram's time at the BBC, because as the work involved, quote, experimental sounds, the BBC's health and safety overseers limited the amount of time any one person could work with it to 3 months. When they told Oram to return to her previous duties, she told them off and set up her own private studio, the first in the UK. This is from her 1959 radio play, Dr. Faustus. This is the point where most histories of Oram would turn towards her Oramics project, an optical-based synthesizer of her own design, not unlike the Russian ANS synth. But we're going to go in a different direction, because in 1972 she published a book called An Individual Note of Music, Sound, and Electronics. This book, which would not see a second edition until 2016, can best be described as a metaphysics of audio engineering. She allowed herself to, quote, go a-wandering, a-wondering, and amusing so that we can sniff the air expectantly in all directions. She speculates wildly in such areas as examining the individual personality as a collection of resonant filters, responding dramatically to certain inputs and ideas, blocking others out entirely. She talked a great deal about resonance and feedback, topics that were also central to El-Dabh and the Barons. A personal note is significant for how she takes a deep knowledge in an esoteric field of the physical sciences, acoustics and audio electronics, and leverages it towards a unified theory of the cosmos and humanity. She talks about operating on 3 levels or wave bands, which she defines as the physical, the mental, and the solital, a mode of non-linguistic thought that seems to operate outside time according to different rules than normal thinking. She builds her arguments around a handful of analogs. First, she speculates that resonant formant filter circuits, which increase certain frequencies while attenuating others, could form a model for human perception with our likes, dislikes, and indifferences. Or a bank of oscillators, quote, It is as if each human being is an instrument of concord and discord, consisting of thousands upon thousands of finely tuned circuits, each circuit with its own control of pitch and loudness, able to adjust its voice in harmony or dissonance, in balance and accord, so that it becomes part of a great pattern which makes the individual. Second, she describes feedback, especially as used in tape echoes, as analogous to memory, dreams, and madness. She talks about how it has been established that it takes 1/18 of a second to register a sensory stimulus, and wonders if this could be considered like the time it takes for a magnetic tape to travel from the recording to the playback head of a tape echo before it's fed back onto itself and recorded again. What she's doing is an esoteric practice in that she's speculating beyond the facts. It's a poetic sort of science based on metaphor and correspondence. She writes, I agree that we cannot know what things truly are, but what we can do is retain our individual right to view them in our own fashion, to transform them according to our own character, and thus to gain more insight into ourselves and our own abilities. What is most important to you, is that you retain the integrity of the personal wave pattern. The knowledge that this wave pattern is under your control, able to be shifted according to your wish and not just the whim and mercy of outside agent or inside abnormality. This integrity of control is the sanity of experience. When the personal formants in all three wave bands are under firm control, we term it sanity. And when a person has gained such perfect control of all three wave bands that whenever he wishes, he is able to remove the main energy in his personal wave pattern from the fundamental to any of the harmonics, and so view life from a different aspect, we term this super sanity. It's possible to hear in passages such as this reverberations of theosophical thought in the early 20th century, but perhaps the greatest achievement of her personal note is that beyond all the poetic speculation, it's a very good treatise for how to make electronic tape music. Her acoustical science is solid, as is her practical understanding of the material. This places her in a long tradition of alchemist researchers for whom the technical and the spiritual were of a single unified whole. This brings us back to the Barons and their incorporation of cybernetics into music, beginning only a year or two after the field's first general audience publications. In 1947, Charlotte May Beebe Wind and Louis Barron got married. One of their wedding gifts was a German magnetophone tape recorder, one of the first privately owned tape machines in the USA. The cousin who gifted them the machine was an official at 3M, which had just begun manufacturing magnetic tape. The next year in San Francisco, they began to record underground artists and to release on records. One of these writers was Anais Nin, who became close friends with Beebe. In 1949, when they moved to New York City, Nin introduced them to much of her circle. In New York City, the Barons would quickly fall in with John Cage. John Cage was fascinated by the fact that 1 second of recorded tape was around 1/3 of a meter in physical length. This meant that what was tiny in one regard was vast in another. He would hire the Barons as research technicians and fund their studio for several of their first years in the city. The main output from this would be known as the Williams mix, which involved making hundreds of micro-edits of various categories of sounds. The Barons spent a full year just recording the sounds. Through Nin, they would work with and become close with people such as Renate Drux, who threw the party that formed the inspiration for Kenneth Anger's Crowleyan film Inauguration of the Pleasure Dome. Drux was close with Parsons' widow, Cameron, and had been involved in his OTO lodge. She would later paint the cover to the Barons' private label release of the Forbidden Planet soundtrack. But I think a more important member of their circle was Maya Deren, well known for her work documenting and celebrating Haitian ritual music and dance. While this is not explicitly recorded, it's difficult not to see suggestions of spirit work in their use of cybernetic audio oscillators as collaborators. The same year the Barons met Nin, Norbert Werner published the book Cybernetics, which had a profound influence on Louis Barron. Coming out of wartime research on how to design active gun sites to facilitate shooting down airplanes from moving boats, a non-trivial problem, cybernetics was based around the idea of feedback loops. Positive feedback, where each iteration amplifies the result, can quickly destabilize any system, while its opposite could maintain dynamic equilibriums. Like Oram, cybernetic researchers such as Werner saw feedback loops as the key to understanding everything from machines to living organisms to weather systems to the formation of galaxies. Sine wave oscillators are also feedback systems, positive feedback systems. What Lewis realized was that Werner's work would allow him to make complex feedback oscillators which did not have a fixed stable pitch like the ones being used here in Germany. Oscillators, they would change and evolve as the circuits passed through various stages of development. Those behaviors would depend on the design of the various feedback paths. Beebe would later describe how it would often be impossible to coax the circuits into making the same sounds twice. The Barons would record all these circuit behaviors, then edit the recordings into a musical work, a process that defied the binaries being developed over here in Europe. In 1950, the Barons completed their first cybernetic work and the first piece of electronic tape music in the USA, Heavenly Menagerie. This was the same year electronic music began in Cologne. Nin's husband, Ian Hugo, would hire them to score short films in 52 and 54. These films led to them being hired to do the score for MGM's science fiction film Forbidden Planet, not to be confused with Fantastic Planet, the French film from the 70s. They met the Ukrainian filmmaker Maya Dirin through Nin and would later work with her in 1959 on the film The Very Eye of Night. As well as documenting Haitian voodoo, she was also a practitioner. As I said, it's possible to see some of her influence on the Barons' ideas of their circuits as active collaborators. That this idea was in effect by at least 1956 is attested by interviews about their Forbidden Planet music quoted in Nin's diaries. The circuits are our actors, Lewis said. We set them up in a dramatic situation in relation to each other, and we stimulate them to behave in accordance with, to start some kind of provocation to make them fight or make love or whatever. We look on these circuits as genuinely suffering. Each circuit, as I said, has a tendency to do something, though it may rebel against instructions. When it does, we have to knock it around electronically. What we have is a new artistic tool, direct communication by pure emotion rather than a symbol which must be retranslated in the mind. Barron went on to say that whether the circuits actually feel or not, they behave as if they do. They can be made to act, to sound unhappy, for example. When we hear them, we feel unhappy. This is the music from the start of Forbidden Planet to give an example of these circuits. None of this is pre-composed. This is all derived from the recordings. The Barons got involved with Hübner's seduction through witchcraft through the, to make sure that stopped, through the record producer, through the producer. Hübner's husband, the painter Mentor Hübner, had worked on Forbidden Planet, but he and the Barons hadn't met. The Barons were doing their work in New York at the time. Other details about the record's production remain murky. Hübner was a professional psychic medium and had a radio astrology show. Most discussions of the Barons skip over the record entirely, which is strange as it's one of their only original major label record releases. Seduction Through Witchcraft and Vincent Price's Witchcraft, Magic, and Adventure in Demonology, released by Capitol Records the same year, were among the first of the witchcraft records, a part of the mainstream occult revival of the late 60s, early 70s. Electronic music was part of this genre from the beginning, with Paul Beaver playing Moog on Elektra Records' The Zodiac Cosmic Sounds, the first major label spoken word esoteric record in 1967, a year before Wendy Carlos made the Moog synonymous with synthesizers with Switched on Bach. Alex and Maxine Sanders' Which Is Born would be released on A&M in 70. Nate Freeland's The Occult Explosion on United Artists in 73. There were also a number of these releases on smaller and private labels such as LeVay's Black Mass in 68, Barbara the Grey Witch in 70, and Grundella, the Hour of the Witch in 71. A number of these releases, however, Barbara the Grey Witch especially, seem to be taking their cue from the Baron's work rather than Zodiac's psychedelic rock, with minimal synthesizer noise accompanying various spells. Recordings like these raise questions about how deeply abstract electronic music had penetrated into active ritual practice in places like South Bend, Indiana, where the record was recorded. Obviously, records such as these were only one aspect of the popular occult, which also included films and television, including the work of the radiophonic workshop Oram co-founded, whose impact on the contemporaneous folk horror genre would be a lecture unto itself. The use of abstract electronic music in ritual practice during this period is actually one of the areas that I'm most interested in looking into and establishing and documenting. This is one of the spells from Barbara the Grey Witch. The Baron's work ended up being officially remembered as part of the science fiction film history, not the history of cybernetic music or New York experimental music or any of the other histories they contributed to. As with Halim El-Dabh, their importance is only being appreciated in the last 2 decades or so, as a new generation begins to do the writing. In the late 50s, Louis Barron would present their work at a meeting with the Columbia Princeton studio, only to have it dismissed as a novelty. Cybernetic music wouldn't be taken seriously within official electronic music circles for another decade. Many of the other connections I've been discussing were also poorly remembered. The main biography of El-Dabh, for instance, barely mentions ACE or Starwood at all, even though he was involved with them for over a decade. Much of the discussion of Oram's esoteric interests comes from the 2016 reissue of A Personal Note, and even there they merely scratch the surface of a broader topic. We're only at the beginning of a long journey. Thank you very much.